On her wedding night, a Victorian mother would pull her daughter aside and whisper one sentence that would determine whether she lived or died. Not metaphorically, literally. That sentence? Never say no. But this wasn't about love. This wasn't about duty. This was about survival. Because in Victorian England, a husband could legally kill his wife, and the courts would call it justified if she refused him. They called it reasonable chastisement. The law called it his right. And this was just one of dozens of rules Victorian women learned before they turned 15. Rules that kept them alive. Rules that were never written down, but passed from mother to daughter in hurried whispers behind closed doors. Today, we're going to talk about what Victorian women really learned. Not the sanitized version you see in period dramas, the real version, the terrifying version. The version that explains why Victorian women moved through the world like they were walking on glass. Because they were. Let's start with the most important lesson, the one that determined everything else. Your reputation is your life. Not your livelihood, your actual life. In Victorian society, a woman's reputation wasn't just important, it was a physical asset more valuable than property, more protected than money, more fragile than porcelain. And once broken, it could never be repaired. Here's what that meant in practice. If you were seen alone with a man who wasn't your husband, brother, or father, even in broad daylight, even in a public park, you were ruined completely. Your engagement would be broken, your family would disown you, you would never marry, and without marriage, you had no legal way to earn money, own property, or survive. But it gets worse. If a man assaulted you, you were ruined. Not him, you. Because you must have done something to encourage it. You must have looked at him wrong, smiled too much, existed too visibly. If you were raped, you stayed silent. Because reporting it meant admitting it happened, and admitting it happened meant admitting you were now worthless, used goods, damaged property. Victorian women learned this by watching what happened to the girls who didn't stay silent. They saw them shipped off to asylums, locked away in attics, forced into workhouses where they die within 5 years from tuberculosis or starvation. So the lesson was clear. Protect your reputation with your life, because it is your life. But here's the twist. Your reputation wasn't based on what you actually did. It was based on what people thought you did. Perception was reality. Rumor was fact. This created a secondary lesson that was somehow even darker. Trust no one, especially other women. Victorian society turned women against each other with surgical precision, because in a world where one whispered rumor could destroy you completely, other women weren't your allies, they were your competition, your threat, your potential executioners. And the system was designed this way. There were limited spots in society for respectable women, limited wealthy men to marry, limited positions as governesses or companions, so women were taught to view every other woman as someone trying to take their spot. This manifested in brutal ways. At balls, women would accidentally step on each other's dresses, tearing them and making them appear slovenly. They'd start rumors about each other's health, suggesting consumption or madness in the family line. They'd arrange for friends to be accidentally left alone with men, creating compromising situations. One documented case from 1862 describes a woman who spread a rumor that her romantic rival had been seen entering a physician's office. The implication? She was pregnant out of wedlock. The rival lost her engagement, her social standing, and her family in 3 weeks. She hung herself 2 months later. The woman who started the rumor? She married the rival's former fiancé. Victorian women learned early, never confide in female friends, never trust your sisters with secrets, never let your guard down, because the woman smiling at you over tea might be the one sharpening the knife for your back. But controlling your reputation and navigating female competition was just the beginning. The real education came in learning how to manage men without appearing to manage them. This was the most dangerous tightrope walk of all. A Victorian woman had to be completely submissive while also being completely in control. She had to have no opinions while also manipulating every decision. She had to be powerless while also ensuring her own survival. And she had to make it look effortless. This required a specific set of skills that mothers taught daughters through demonstration and whispered instruction. First, the art of suggestion. Never tell a man what to do. Plant an idea in his mind and let him think it was his own. If you wanted to move to a different house, you'd mention how much his mother loved homes with southern exposure. You'd leave property listings where he'd see them. You'd have friends comment on how successful men always chose specific neighborhoods. Within a month, he'd announce he'd decided to move, and you'd act surprised and grateful. Second, the economy of affection. Love was currency, and you never spent it all at once. Too much affection, and he'd take you for granted. Too little, and he'd seek it elsewhere or punish you. You had to maintain a precise balance that kept him invested but never satisfied, always slightly out of reach but never actually distant. Victorian marriage manuals literally coached women on this. One from 1878 advised, "Be warm but not passionate, attentive but not fawning, present but not demanding." Translation: be everything and nothing simultaneously. Third, the management of masculine ego. This was perhaps the most critical skill because male ego was the most dangerous force in a Victorian woman's life. A man whose ego was bruised would lash out, and the law gave him every right to do so. Victorian women learned to absorb insults without reaction, to laugh at jokes at their own expense, to defer to male opinions even when they knew the man was catastrophically wrong, to ask for help with tasks they could easily do themselves because men needed to feel useful. One Victorian diary entry from 1881 describes a woman watching her husband make a business decision she knew would bankrupt them. She said nothing, because saying something would bruise his ego, and a bruised ego was more dangerous than bankruptcy. She was right. They lost everything, but he never hit her. In the calculation of Victorian survival, that counted as a win. But here's where it gets truly dark. All of these lessons, all of these survival tactics were predicated on one foundational truth that Victorian women learned before anything else. You are property, not a person. Property. This wasn't metaphorical. It was legal fact. When a woman married, she ceased to exist as a legal entity. This was called coverture. Her identity was covered by her husband's. She couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't keep her own wages, couldn't have custody of her own children. If she tried to leave an abusive marriage, her husband could legally hunt her down, drag her back, and lock her in their home. The police would help him. If she managed to escape and find work, her husband was legally entitled to her wages. Employers would pay him directly. If she had children and tried to take them, they belonged to the father. Always. Even if he was violent, even if he was drunk, even if he was actively trying to kill her. One case from 1875 documents a woman who fled with her 3 children after her husband broke her arm and threatened to kill her. The courts found her, returned the children to the father, and imprisoned her for kidnapping her own children. She was sentenced to 2 years hard labor. The husband, no charges. He was exercising his legal rights. This is what Victorian women were managing. This is what every lesson, every rule, every whispered piece of advice was designed to navigate. You weren't learning how to thrive. You were learning how to survive being property in a world that could destroy you legally, socially, and physically at any moment. And yet, somehow, Victorian women found ways to claim tiny scraps of power. They developed elaborate codes and signals invisible to men. The language of flowers let them communicate entire conversations. The placement of a brooch on a dress indicated availability or disinterest. The angle of a fan could send messages across a crowded room. They created underground networks, women who would hide those fleeing abusive marriages, doctors who would provide contraception secretly, servants who would carry messages and arrange meetings. They learned to read men with terrifying accuracy. They could identify a dangerous man in seconds. They could predict violent outbursts hours before they happened. They developed a sixth sense for threat that kept them alive. And they passed all of this down, mother to daughter, aunt to niece, older sister to younger, a shadow education that ran parallel to the official one of needlework and piano lessons. This education had no curriculum, no textbooks, no examinations. But it was far more important than anything taught in schools, because it was the difference between life and death. Victorian women weren't the delicate, fainting creatures we see in movies. They were strategists, operators, survivors navigating an unimaginably hostile world with whatever tools they could scrape together. They learned to read micro-expressions before psychology existed. They learned negotiation tactics that modern hostage negotiators would recognize. They learned to weaponize charm, tears, silence, and submission. They learned all of this before they turned 15. Think about that. While they were still children, they were being trained in survival tactics for a war that would last their entire lives, a war they could never win, only survive. The phrase "act like a lady" wasn't about etiquette, it was about survival. Ladies lived longer, ladies got better treatment, ladies had a chance. Women who stepped outside those boundaries were destroyed, swiftly, publicly, as warnings to others. And here's perhaps the most disturbing part. Most Victorian women never questioned the system. They couldn't afford to. Questioning meant thinking. Thinking meant realizing the horror of your situation. Realizing the horror meant either breaking or going mad. So they didn't think. They performed. They survived. They taught their daughters to do the same. Generation after generation of women learning the same lessons. Your reputation is your life. Trust no one. Manage men without them knowing. You are property. Act accordingly. It's been 150 years since the height of the Victorian era. We look back and feel relief that we've moved past that darkness. But have we? Women still learn to smile at men who make them uncomfortable because confrontation is dangerous. Women still police each other's behavior, reputations, and choices. Women still navigate male ego as a survival skill. Women still bear the responsibility for men's actions toward them. The Victorian era didn't invent these patterns. It just made them explicit, codified them, turned them into a system. But the patterns themselves, they're older than Victoria's reign, and they've outlived it too. Modern women still learn versions of these lessons. We just don't call them that anymore. We call it reading the room, being professional, not causing drama, being realistic. But underneath the modern language, the core lesson remains the same. The lesson Victorian mothers whispered to their daughters on wedding nights. The lesson that determined who lived and who was destroyed. Learn to navigate a world that wasn't built for you. Learn to survive in systems designed to control you. Learn to smile while you're being crushed. And maybe that's the darkest lesson of all. Not what Victorian women had to learn, but how little has actually changed. How many of those whispered lessons are still being passed down, just in slightly different forms. The Victorian era ended, but the survival tactics it taught, those are still here. If this video made you think differently about history, about survival, about the invisible education women receive, share it, because these stories need to be told. These lessons need to be examined. This darkness needs to be acknowledged. Not to stay there, but to finally actually leave it behind. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories, more uncomfortable truths,